The Tides Whispers. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Horizon. The scent of salt and the distant cry of gulls were a constant companion in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. For Sarah Anderson, they were also a constant ache, a phantom limb of memory. 12 years, 12 long, agonizing years had passed since that bright, deceptively calm Saturday. 12 years since her husband Dan Anderson, and their bright-eyed, adventurous 10-year-old daughter, Emily, had set sail on their beloved boat, the Sea Breeze, for a weekend adventure. The forecast had been clear, the Gulf waters tranquil. They never returned. The initial hours had been laced with a nagging anxiety, growing into a cold dread as sunset painted the horizon in hues of orange and purple, but brought no sight of their sail. Then came the frantic calls, the frantic searches. The Coast Guard deployed its fleet. The FBI initiated an investigation. Weeks turned into months, months into a year. The Sea Breeze was never found. No distress signal, no wreckage, no bodies. Nothing. Sarah, 45 then, was 45 now. But the woman she had been ceased to exist that day. She was declared a widow. Emily, her vibrant, curious Emily, was officially listed as missing, presumed lost at sea. Grief had become a tangible presence in her small waterfront home. A thick, suffocating blanket that muted every color, every sound. Her life had shrunk to a routine of quiet endurance, punctuated by the endless review of old photographs, faded videos, and the relentless, looping reel of what-ifs in her mind. Friends had urged her to move on, to sell the house, to find new purpose. But the house, every creaking floorboard, every sun-drenched window, was a shrine to her lost family. It held the echoes of Dan's booming laugh, Emily's childish giggles. To leave would be to abandon them, to surrender to the crushing finality of their disappearance. So Sarah stayed, clinging to fragments of hope, to any sign, no matter how small, that they were not truly gone. She worked part-time at the local library, lost in the quiet solace of books, but her heart remained adrift, a desolate vessel on an endless sea. One blistering July morning, the kind where the air shimmered above the asphalt, Sarah found herself wandering through a local flea market. A rare deviation from her usual routine. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a distraction from the suffocating heat of her thoughts. Rows of dusty antiques, forgotten trinkets, and faded curiosities blurred past her eyes until something caught her gaze. It was a seashell, a common conch perhaps, but something about its worn, pearlescent sheen called to her. She picked it up, running her thumb over its smooth, cool surface, and then her breath hitched. On the inner curve, almost imperceptible against the swirling patterns, was a tiny, precisely etched carving. Her fingers traced the familiar letters, Emily plus Dan. Breeze always finds its way home. Her vision blurred. This wasn't just a seashell. This was their seashell, the one Dan had bought for Emily on their last beach trip, just weeks before they vanished. They had spent an entire afternoon meticulously carving that inscription together, giggling as Emily's small hand guided Dan's larger one. Sarah had watched them, her heart full, never imagining the chilling prophecy those words would later hold. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. How? How could this be? This exact, unique shell, hundreds of miles from where they had disappeared, years after they were presumed lost. She looked up, frantically searching for the vendor. An old man, his face weathered by sun and sea, sat behind the table, calmly polishing a brass telescope. "Sir," Sarah's voice was a shaky whisper. "This shell, where did you get it?" The man, his eyes rheumy but kind, looked up. "Ah, that old thing? A beauty, ain't it? Picked it up at an auction, down in Mexico. Small port town, Las Estrellas, a few months back. Was part of a salvage lot from an old fishing boat, I recall. Mexico, Las Estrellas, a small, old fishing boat. For 12 years, Sarah had carried the unbearable weight of emptiness. Now a spark ignited within her, small but fierce, banishing the shadows of grief. This wasn't just a sign. This was a direct, impossible line thrown across the vast, empty ocean of her despair. The breeze always finds its way home. And suddenly, Sarah knew, with a certainty that defied logic and reason, that Daniel and Emily, somehow, against all odds, had survived. Her life, once a quiet elegy, was now a desperate, unwavering quest. She had to go to Las Estrellas. She had to find out why. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Gulf. The decision to go to Las Estrellas was met with polite skepticism from her few remaining friends, and outright pity from Agent Mark Jenkins, the FBI agent who had overseen the Seabreeze investigation all those years ago. He had called her quest a grasping at straws, a symptom of prolonged grief. But Sarah, fueled by an almost manic energy, ignored them all. The Seashell was not a straw. It was a lifeline, a tangible piece of her lost family. She sold her mother's antique pearl necklace, a painful but necessary sacrifice. She took out a small loan against the house, mortgaging her last tangible asset. She researched Las Estrellas, a remote, forgotten fishing village on the Yucatan Peninsula, a world away from the manicured lawns of Ocean Springs. It was a place where time moved slower, where stories often lingered like the humid air. The journey was arduous. Buses rumbled through dusty landscapes, the air thick with unfamiliar smells and sounds. Finally, after days of travel, she arrived in Las Estrellas. It was a sun-baked mosaic of brightly painted shacks, fishing boats bobbing in a turquoise harbor, and the pervasive scent of grilled fish and diesel. The people, though poor, met her with curious, gentle eyes. Sarah's Spanish, rusty from high school, was barely adequate, but her resolve was boundless. She carried a faded photo of Dan, his handsome face crinkling at the corners of his eyes, and a more recent one of Emily, her 10-year-old self, gap-toothed and beaming. She approached everyone: shopkeepers, fishermen mending nets, women hanging laundry. "Disculpe, señor," she'd begin, her voice hoarse. "Have you seen these people? They were lost at sea many years ago." Most shook their heads, their faces sympathetic but blank. A few offered kind words. "Lo siento, señora." The auction house, a ramshackle building near the docks, yielded no further clues. The old man who ran it remembered the salvage lot vaguely, but couldn't recall who had brought it in or from which boat it had been recovered. It was common practice for local fishermen to sell items they found adrift. Days bled into a week, then 2. Despair began to creep back, cold and insidious. The Seashell, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a cruel trick. Had she truly mortgaged her future on a desperate fantasy? One afternoon, Seeking solace from the relentless sun and her growing disappointment, Sarah sat in a small, open-air cafe near the docks. The rhythmic slap of waves against the seawall was the only sound. She watched the fishermen return, their faces tanned and weathered. Her gaze fell upon one young man, perhaps in his early 20s. He was lean, with dark, sun-streaked hair falling over intense, sea-green eyes. There was something about his movements, the way he handled his nets, the quiet intensity of his gaze, that stirred a deep, unsettling memory within her. His eyes, they held a familiar light, a depth that reminded her eerily of Dan. He seemed detached, a solitary figure amidst the bustling activity. His name, she overheard another fisherman call out, was David. David. He lived on a secluded island just off the coast, she learned, with a small, close-knit community. He was known for his uncanny knowledge of the sea, his almost preternatural ability to read the tides and weather. He was an enigma, rarely spoke and kept to himself. Sarah watched him, her heart thrumming with a strange mix of fear and recognition. Then, as he paused to coil a rope, she noticed something else. On his left wrist, intertwined with a collection of simple, shell-beaded bracelets, was an intricate knot of worn, sun-faded rope. It was a double carrick bend, tied with a precision that only a seasoned sailor would achieve. It was identical to the complex knots Dan had taught Emily to tie, the kind he called their lucky knots. Emily had made him a bracelet exactly like that, one of their last shared projects. Her breath caught in her throat. She had to know. Swallowing hard, Sarah approached him. "Hola," she began, her voice a little shaky. David looked up, his sea-green eyes, so startlingly familiar, met hers. They were wary, ancient. I couldn't help but notice your bracelet," Sarah continued, gesturing to his wrist. "My husband, he used to tie knots just like that. And my daughter, she made him one." David's gaze lingered on her, then shifted to his wrist. "My father taught me," he said, his voice surprisingly deep, a little rough, as if unused to prolonged speech. "He was a great sailor." "Your father?" Sarah probed gently. "What was his name?" David hesitated, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Capitan," he said simply. That's what they called him. Eleanor's heart hammered. Capitan, captain, Dan. He was always captain to Emily. She reached into her bag, her hand trembling as she pulled out the faded photograph of 10-year-old Emily. "This is my daughter Emily," she said, holding it out. She disappeared at sea with her father 12 years ago." David looked at the photo. His eyes widened, a flicker of something raw and profound flashing through them. He recoiled slightly, turning his head away, his jaw tightening. He said nothing, simply stood there, his back to her, rigid with an unspoken emotion. Then, without a word, he turned and strode away, disappearing into the crowd of fishermen. Sarah watched him go, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. That reaction, that look in his eyes, it was more than a coincidence. It was a connection. Emily and Dan. Breeze always finds its way home. She had heard whispers about the village's wise old doctor, a man named Leo Cabrera, who knew every story, every secret of this remote community. He was her last hope, and she prayed, with a fervent, desperate hope she hadn't felt in years, that he held the missing pieces to Emily's, to David's, and to her own shattered life. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Tale. Dr. Leo Cabrera's small clinic was a haven sent of antiseptic and herbs. He was a man in his late 50s, his face kind and deeply lined, his eyes wise and weary. Sarah sat opposite him, her voice hushed, recounting her improbable journey. The Seashell, the strange young man named David, his reaction to Emily's photograph. Dr. Cabrera listened patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze fixed on some distant point. When Sarah finished, a profound silence filled the room, broken only by the chirping of cicadas outside. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "Señora, your story, it echoes a tale whispered here for many years, a tale of survival and of sorrow." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Please, doctor, tell me." "Many years ago," Dr. Cabrera began, his eyes clouding with memory. "Perhaps 12, maybe 13, a great storm raged in the Gulf, one of the worst any of us had seen. Days later, an old, battered fishing trawler from a distant port limped into our harbor. On board, they carried 2 souls they had found drifting, barely alive, a man, severely injured and very ill, and a small child. A boy, they thought. Sarah held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The man," Dr. Cabrera continued, "was a capitan, they said, a strong, proud man even in his weakness. He spoke little, but his last words before he passed were of the child. He begged the fishermen to take the child to this island, to the small, isolated community there. He said the child would be safe, that they would care for him. He pointed to a faint tattoo on his own arm, a letter D perhaps, and muttered something like David or Danya." He paused, a sad smile touching his lips. "We did what we could for the Capitan, but his injuries were too great, and he was too weak from starvation and exposure. He died in my clinic, peacefully. We buried him on the island, as he wished, by the sea." Sarah's vision blurred. Dan, her Dan. He had died, alone, begging for Emily's safety. The pain was excruciating, yet strangely, mercifully, it was mixed with a powerful wave of relief. He had survived the storm. He had fought. He had saved her. And the child? Sarah choked out, tears streaming down her face. "The child," Dr. Cabrera continued, his gaze direct and empathetic, "was deeply traumatized. He spoke very little, and never of his past. He seemed to have forgotten his own name, his own life before the storm. The fishermen, remembering the Capitan's last words and seeing a faded inscription on a small, worn charm around the child's neck. They thought it said David, so they named him David. He was quiet, solitary, but fiercely intelligent. He had an uncanny understanding of the sea, as if born of it. He was a natural sailor, a master of knots, of navigation. He learned quickly from the island community, who raised him as their own." Dr. Cabrera reached across his desk, taking Sarah's trembling hand. "Señora, what you describe in this young man, David, his eyes, his knowledge of the sea, the knot in his bracelet, it aligns perfectly. The Capitan he speaks of, the man who taught him to tie those knots, it sounds very much like your husband." Sarah could barely breathe. "And Emily," she whispered, the name feeling alien on her tongue when referring to David. "They thought she was a boy because she was so traumatized she forgot her own identity? It is not uncommon in cases of severe trauma, especially in children," Dr. Cabrera confirmed gently. "The mind protects itself." She adopted the persona that was given to her, clinging to the fragments of what she remembered of her father, his strength, his name, love for the sea. Perhaps the name David resonated because it was close to Dan, or because it was what her father last uttered with purpose. Sarah buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. 12 years of agonizing uncertainty, of a void in her soul, suddenly, miraculously, had an answer. A heartbreaking, yet ultimately miraculous answer. Dan was gone, but he had lived long enough to save their daughter. And Emily, her Emily, was alive. Changed, yes, but alive. A boy named David, raised by the sea, carrying the echoes of her father's lessons, unaware of her true self. When her sobs subsided, Sarah looked up, her eyes blazing with a fierce, newfound determination. "Doctor," she said, her voice firm, "you must take me to this island. I need to see her. I need to bring her home." Dr. Cabrera nodded, a sympathetic smile on his kind face. "Of course, Señora. The tide is with us. We leave at dawn." The long night was a blur of emotions, searing grief for Dan, overwhelming joy for Emily, and a profound sense of awe at the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The breeze always finds its way home, and tomorrow, Sarah would go to the ends of the earth to bring her home. Chapter 4: The Island of Whispers. The journey to the isolated island off the coast of Las Estrellas was short, yet felt like an eternity to Sarah. Dr. Cabrera's small fishing boat cut through the calm morning waters, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the tranquil sea. Sarah's heart pounded with a desperate mix of anticipation and fear. What if David, Emily, didn't recognize her? What if the trauma was too deep? As they approached the island, its green slopes rose gently from the turquoise water, dotted with a scattering of simple, thatched roof huts. It was a place of quiet serenity, untouched by the outside world. A few figures emerged from the huts, watching their arrival with mild curiosity. Dr. Cabrera guided Sarah to a small, secluded burial site on a bluff overlooking the ocean. There, amidst a few other simple markers, was a rough-hewn stone with a faded, hand-carved inscription, Capitan. Below it, a few shells were carefully placed. Sarah fell to her knees, tears blurring her vision. This was it. This was where Dan rested. He had made it to land. He had saved their daughter. She touched the cold stone, a silent farewell, a profound thanks. He had lived, he had fought, and he had protected. As she stood, Dr. Cabrera gently took her arm. "He is here, Señora. He watches over her. Now, come, let us find your daughter." They found David near the shoreline, mending a fishing net with practiced, almost meditative movements. He looked up as they approached, his sea-green eyes wary, but no longer hostile. He acknowledged Dr. Cabrera with a small nod. Then his gaze settled on Sarah, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Sarah's throat tightened. She remembered the vibrant, curious little girl, her daughter Emily, who had filled their home with laughter. This young man, lean and hardened by years of survival at sea, bore little resemblance to the child she remembered. Yet those eyes, those were Dan's eyes and Emily's. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. She hesitated, then pressed play on a video she had watched countless times over the past 12 years. It was a short clip of Emily, taken on their last summer vacation. 10-year-old Emily, standing on the deck of the Sea Breeze, her pigtails flying in the wind, singing a silly made-up song about a dolphin. Her voice high and clear, punctuated by a mischievous giggle. Dan's voice from behind the camera joined in the chorus, deep and joyful. The familiar sound filled the quiet island air. David's eyes, fixed on the screen, widened. His hands, which had been deftly knotting the fishing net, slowly stilled. His breath hitched. The song continued, Emily's childish voice echoing through time. Suddenly, a profound, gut-wrenching sob tore from David's chest. His face contorted, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He reached out a trembling hand, his finger gently touching the image of his younger self on the phone screen. Mama, the word raw and choked, tore through the air. Mama. Sarah dropped her phone, a cry escaping her lips. Emily! She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around the young man who was, impossibly, her daughter. He was stiff at first. Then his body seemed to melt into her embrace, his sobs racking his frame. It's Mama, baby. It's Mama. You're home, Emily. You're home, Sarah murmured, rocking him gently, tears streaming down both their faces. Slowly, hesitantly, David began to speak. His voice was hoarse, fragmented, the words coming in halting bursts. He spoke of the storm, the breeze breaking apart, of Dan's heroic efforts to keep them afloat, to keep them alive. He spoke of drifting, of starvation, of the searing sun and the terrifying silence of the vast ocean. Then the darker part of the story unfolded. They had been picked up by a larger vessel, not a fishing boat, but a freighter. It was rough, unwelcoming. They were held captive, forced to work, treated as cargo. It wasn't pirates, but a crew involved in illicit activities, probably drug smuggling, using the remote waters for their operations. Dan, despite his deteriorating health, had seen an opportunity. In a desperate, final act of sabotage, he had disabled their communication equipment, causing a massive delay and diverting them from their course. In the chaos, he had managed to get Emily to a small, old fishing boat, telling the captain, a kind, older man, to take Emily to the nearest isolated community, to safety, away from the dangerous freighter. He told me, "Go, Emily. Find your way home. Mama is waiting." David recounted, his voice catching. He told the fisherman, "My son David, take care of him." He pointed to the bracelet, the one I made him. He confused my name with the bracelet. The trauma, combined with Dan's final desperate words, had cemented the male identity in Emily's mind. She had clung to the name David, a constant echo of her father's dying wish, and the island community, seeing a small, resilient boy, had affirmed it. He died in the old captain's arms. After making sure I was safe, David whispered, the memory raw and fresh. He called me David. Sarah held him tighter, her heart breaking and mending all at once. Dan had carried his love and his hope for Emily all the way to his last breath. He had been a hero, beyond anything she could have imagined. Emily, her precious daughter, had survived the unimaginable, hiding behind a new identity, a self-protective shield built from trauma and a father's dying wish. The whispers of the tide, the hidden message in the shell, the years of silent waiting. It had all led to this. Her Emily, hardened by survival, yet still her child, was finally, truly coming home. Chapter 5, Reclaiming Echoes. The journey back to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, with Emily, now David, by her side, was a surreal blur for Sarah. The flight, the customs, the curious glances from strangers. Emily, still quiet, still withdrawn, clung to Sarah's hand, her sea-green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something akin to wonder at the bustling world she had re-entered after 12 years. She wore clothes Sarah had bought her, comfortable, loose-fitting, still favoring the practical, masculine style she had adopted on the island. Sarah knew this was just the beginning of a long, arduous journey, but the mere fact of Emily's presence, her warm hand in hers, was a miracle. Their arrival in Ocean Springs was not quiet. Agent Mark Jenkins, the FBI agent who had been so skeptical of Sarah's quest, met them at the small regional airport. His face, usually impassive, was a mask of utter disbelief and shock. "Mrs. Anderson?" he stammered, his eyes fixed on Emily. This is Impossible. Nothing is impossible, Agent Jenkins, Sarah said, her voice firm, a new authority in her tone. This is my daughter Emily. She survived. A DNA test was conducted immediately, a formality that Sarah knew was necessary for the official records. The results, as expected, confirmed what Sarah already knew in her heart. David, the young man from the isolated island, was indeed Emily Anderson. The news, once confirmed by the FBI, exploded into a national sensation. Local news channels, then national ones, picked up the story of the father and daughter lost at sea, the mother's unwavering hope, and the incredible, miraculous return of a child believed to be dead. Emily's recovery was slow, delicate, and deeply personal. She was, after all, a 22-year-old woman who had spent half her life living as a boy, a survivor of unimaginable trauma. The island community, in their kindness, had protected her, but they had also inadvertently locked her into a defensive identity. Sarah became Emily's anchor. She patiently reintroduced Emily to her old life, to the girl she once was. They spent hours sifting through old photo albums, watching home videos. Emily, at first, would flinch from the images of her younger self, from the sound of her own childish voice. But slowly, painstakingly, the memories began to surface, like treasures emerging from the deep. "Mama," Emily would whisper one day, looking at a photo of herself in a ballet tutu. "I used to dance?" "You did, sweetie," Sarah would respond, her voice thick with emotion. "You loved it." Emily began to tentatively explore her femininity. Sarah took her shopping for clothes, not forcing anything, but offering gentle suggestions. Emily, with her sun-streaked hair and lean, strong body, began to gravitate towards simpler, more comfortable dresses, then skirts, then, slowly, towards clothes that reflected a growing comfort in her female form. She started letting her hair grow longer, styling it. Her voice, once rough from disuse, and the adopted persona, began to soften, to reclaim its natural timbre. The island had taught her resilience, survival, and a profound connection to the ocean. These were strengths. But Sarah also encouraged her to seek therapy, to process the deep-seated trauma. Emily found solace in painting, expressing emotions she couldn't yet articulate. She started sketching the sea, the boats, the island, but also, hesitantly, portraits of her father, and then her mother. Publicly, Sarah made a heartfelt statement, thanking the people of Las Estrellas and the island community for saving her daughter. She spoke of Dan's heroism, his ultimate sacrifice to ensure Emily's survival. She made sure that the story honored his memory, transforming his disappearance from a tragic mystery into a testament to enduring love. The fishing boat captain who had rescued Emily and the islanders who had raised her were recognized and sent generous donations from a fund established in Dan's name. Emily, slowly but surely, began to shed the persona of David. She became more outgoing, more comfortable in her own skin. She even started using her full name, Emily. Proudly, she reconnected with some of her childhood friends, who, though initially shocked, welcomed her with open arms. The sea, which had once threatened to claim her, now beckoned with a different purpose. Emily decided to pursue a degree in marine biology, a natural evolution of her deep knowledge of the ocean, inspired by both her father's love for the sea and her own unique upbringing. She wanted to protect the ocean, to understand its mysteries, to honor the life it had given her. Chapter 6. The Unbroken Thread. Years continued to unfurl, gentle and healing. Emily graduated with honors, her unique background a source of quiet strength rather than lingering trauma. Her bond with Sarah grew deeper, forged in shared pain and the miracle of reunion. They often revisited the small, weathered seashell, tracing the familiar inscription, "Emily plus Dan. Breeze always finds its way home." It was a constant reminder of the incredible journey, the profound love, and the enduring hope that had brought them back together. Emily found a profound sense of purpose in her work as a marine biologist. She specialized in ocean conservation, dedicating her life to protecting the very waters that had once held her captive, and then, unexpectedly, delivered her back to life. Her intimate knowledge of the sea, honed by years of survival on the island, gave her a unique perspective, a deep empathy for the ocean's delicate ecosystem. She often spoke about her father, Dan, not as a victim of the sea, but as a hero who had navigated its treachery with immense courage, imparting knowledge that ultimately saved her. She saw his legacy in every rescued sea turtle, every protected coral reef. Sarah watched her daughter flourish, a profound peace settling in her heart. The gaping wound left by the double loss had slowly, miraculously, begun to heal. The silent grief that had shadowed her for 12 years had been replaced by a quiet, enduring joy. She knew Dan was gone, but his spirit lived on in Emily's passion, in her strength, in the very essence of the woman she had become. He had not only saved Emily's life, but had instilled in her a profound understanding of resilience and survival, skills that shaped her into an extraordinary individual. Agent Jenkins, the once skeptical FBI agent, became a staunch admirer of Sarah's tenacity. He often referred to Emily's story in talks on missing persons cases, highlighting the often unseen human element and the power of unwavering faith. The story of the sea breeze became a legend in Ocean Springs, a bittersweet tale of loss and miraculous return. Emily never forgot her roots on the island. She maintained contact with Dr. Cabrera and the community that had raised her, visiting them regularly, offering support and resources. They had given her a safe haven, the new family when she had none, and she carried their quiet strength and resourcefulness within her. She introduced them to conservation efforts, bringing sustainable fishing practices and ecological awareness to the remote community that had once simply survived by the rhythms of the sea. Years later, Sarah, now a grandmother to Emily's children, often sat by the window in her Ocean Springs home, watching the waves roll in. The scent of salt air still filled her lungs, but now it carried not the ache of loss, but the sweet scent of triumph and enduring love. The sea, once a symbol of the great unknown, of consuming despair, had become a testament to the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter and the unwavering hope of a mother. The breeze had indeed found its way home, and in its wake it had left not just Emily, but a profound understanding that even in the deepest despair, hope can surface, and that the whispers of the tide can carry secrets more miraculous than any storm can destroy. The thread of their family, though stretched taut by tragedy, had never truly broken. It had simply been rewoven, stronger and more beautiful than before, a testament to love's enduring power.